I want you to think about something we take completely for granted. Police. Officers in uniforms, patrol cars, 911 calls. But for most of human history, none of this existed. When conflicts erupted, communities handled it themselves through kinship groups, village elders, or just whoever was strongest. There was no organized force you could call. No one trained specifically to enforce laws. That came much, much later. The first organized law enforcers we know about appeared in ancient Egypt around 2000 BCE. They were called the Medjay. Originally, they were Nubian warriors hired as desert scouts, essentially border patrol in the harsh terrain between Egypt and Nubia. Their job was to protect trade routes and watch for threats in the vast, unforgiving desert regions that bordered Egyptian territory. But as Egyptian cities grew larger and more complex, the Medjay's role changed dramatically. They moved from the desert into urban centers. By the New Kingdom period, roughly 1550 to 1070 BCE, the Medjay had become Egypt's primary police force. They patrolled markets to prevent theft, guarded temples and royal palaces, protected vital trade routes from bandits, and investigated crimes ranging from robbery to murder. This was a massive shift from informal community justice, where disputes were settled by local leaders, to a specialized group whose entire job was law enforcement. The Medjay proved that as societies got more complex, with more people, more trade, and more potential for conflict, they needed dedicated people to maintain order. Fast forward to 6 CE in Rome. Emperor Augustus created something called the Vigiles. Rome had grown into a city of over 1 million people, massive, crowded, and chaotic. Fires broke out constantly in the packed wooden apartment buildings called insulae. Crime spiked after dark when the narrow streets became dangerous. Augustus needed a solution that could handle both problems. The Vigiles were organized into 7 cohorts of about 1,000 men each, divided across Rome's 14 districts. Their primary job was firefighting, but they also patrolled at night, broke up fights, arrested criminals, and investigated suspicious activity. This was revolutionary for several reasons. The Vigiles were paid by the state, not by victims or through rewards. They were trained for specific duties and given equipment: buckets, axes, pumps for firefighting, and basic weapons for law enforcement. They were assigned to geographic areas and operated on schedules with clear chains of command. It was one of the first examples of what we'd recognize as professional policing. Not just reactive justice where you punish someone after a crime, but proactive patrols meant to prevent problems before they escalate. Jump ahead to medieval England, around the 9th century during the Anglo-Saxon period. This is where we get the word sheriff. It comes from share reeve. The reeve was an official who managed a shire, which was an administrative region similar to a modern county. The shire reeve represented the king's authority in local areas far from the royal court. Their job was remarkably broad: collect taxes and fines, maintain order and pursue criminals, oversee local courts and ensure justice was carried out, and enforce royal decrees and laws across their territory. Sheriffs had real power backed by the crown. They could raise puzzes, groups of citizens required by law to help pursue criminals. They could arrest suspects and hold them for trial. They managed jails and sometimes carried out executions. But they weren't police in the modern sense. They were administrators who handled law enforcement as one duty among many others, including financial and judicial responsibilities. Still, the role proved essential. As England's legal system became more formalized over the centuries, the sheriff became the crucial link between royal authority and local communities. A model that would eventually cross the Atlantic Ocean centuries later and shape American law enforcement. Alongside sheriffs, medieval towns relied on watchmen and constables to handle day-to-day law enforcement. These were ordinary citizens appointed or drafted to patrol at night. In many places, it was a rotating duty. Every able-bodied man was required to take a turn walking the streets with a lantern and a stick or staff. Constables had slightly more authority. They could arrest people, break up disturbances, and bring offenders before magistrates. But this system had serious problems that became worse over time. Watchmen were untrained and often had no idea how to handle dangerous situations. Many were unwilling participants who resented the duty and did the bare minimum. Some were elderly or infirm, sent to watch duty because they couldn't do other work. Stories of watchmen sleeping on duty or being drunk were common. There was no standardization, no accountability, and no way to remove incompetent watchmen. As towns grew into cities during the 1700s, especially during the Industrial Revolution, this informal approach couldn't keep up. Populations exploded. Crime rose dramatically. Riots became more common. It was increasingly clear that relying on part-time, unpaid, untrained civilians wasn't working anymore. In 1749, a novelist and magistrate named Henry Fielding tried something new in London. He recruited a small group of men, initially just 6, to investigate crimes in his jurisdiction. They operated out of Bow Street Magistrates' Court, so they became known as the Bow Street Runners. Unlike watchmen who just patrolled, these men were paid to actively investigate. They tracked down criminals, gathered evidence, interviewed witnesses, and worked cases methodically over days or weeks. The Bow Street Runners weren't perfect. They sometimes took rewards from victims and focused on cases that paid well rather than serving the public good. Equally. But they proved that professional investigators could be effective. They built case files with written records. They developed informant networks throughout London's criminal underworld. They even pursued criminals across county lines, which was unusual at the time when jurisdiction was strictly local. For the first time, law enforcement wasn't just about catching someone in the act or responding to immediate disturbances. It was about solving crimes after. Fact through investigation, evidence, and persistence. By the 1820s, London's crime problem had gotten significantly worse despite the Bow Street Runners' efforts. Henry Fielding's son and others continued the runners' work, but it wasn't nearly enough for a city that had grown to over 1 million people. In 1829, Home Secretary Sir Robert Peel pushed through the Metropolitan Police Act in Parliament. This created the Metropolitan Police Service, the first modern professional police force. Peel's officers wore distinctive blue uniforms to be easily identifiable, carried wooden truncheons rather than firearms, and patrolled assigned beats on foot for regular visibility. But what made Peel's model truly revolutionary were his 9 principles of policing. He argued that police effectiveness shouldn't be measured by the number of arrests or convictions, but by the absence of crime and disorder. Prevention over punishment. He insisted that police legitimacy depended on public approval and cooperation, not on fear or force. Officers were meant to be part of the community, not an occupying force or a military unit. Police should use only the minimum force necessary. They should maintain a relationship with the public that demonstrates absolute impartial service to law. These ideas, radical at the time and controversial among those who wanted a more militarized approach, became the foundation for policing models worldwide. When English colonists arrived in America, they brought the sheriff system with them as a familiar model. The first colonial sheriffs appeared in the early 1600s. Virginia appointed sheriffs in 1634, making it one of the earliest. Their role was nearly identical to their English counterparts: enforce laws, run courts and jails, collect taxes and fines, and maintain order in growing settlements. But in the colonies, sheriffs often had even more power because formal government structures were sparse and distant. As settlers pushed westward through the Appalachians and eventually across the Great Plains, sheriffs became even more critical to frontier society. On the frontier, sheriffs were often the only law enforcement for hundreds of square miles. They dealt with everything: land disputes between settlers, livestock theft, violent crime including murder, conflicts with Native American tribes, and enforcement of federal laws in territories not yet organized as states. The image of the frontier sheriff, riding alone into dangerous territory, facing down outlaws, maintaining order through personal courage, wasn't just mythology, created by dime novels. In many places, it was reality. Sheriffs had to be tough, resourceful, and willing to enforce the law with minimal backup, sometimes forming pizzazz from local citizens when facing serious threats. As American cities grew explosively in the 1800s due to immigration and industrialization, the old night watch system collapsed under pressure. Boston acted first. In 1838, the city created a paid, unified police force, the first in America. Officers wore badges for identification, patrolled during the day as well as night, and answered to a central command structure. New York followed in 1845 with a force modeled on London's Metropolitan Police, and Philadelphia in 1854. These weren't just upgraded watch systems. They were professional organizations with ranks, written rules, and regular pay. Officers were full-time employees, not volunteers or part-timers. Not volunteers or part-timers. This was the birth of American urban policing as we know it. By the late 1800s, police departments across America started standardizing their operations. Officers wore uniforms to be easily identifiable and to create a sense of authority and legitimacy. Departments adopted military-style ranks, sergeants, lieutenants, captains, chiefs, creating clear hierarchies and chains of command. Call boxes appeared on street corners so officers on foot patrol could communicate with headquarters and call for backup. Then came telegraphs, which allowed departments to share information about criminals across cities. Telephones followed, and eventually two-way radios in the 1930s. Each innovation made police faster, more coordinated, and more effective. The early 1900s brought motor vehicles, which transformed policing more than almost any other innovation. Suddenly, officers could cover much larger areas and respond to calls in minutes instead of hours. Patrol cars became standard equipment by the 1920s. Departments created specialized detective bureaus, forensic laboratories, and formal training academies. Fingerprinting became standard practice after 1901. Photography allowed officers to document crime scenes and create databases of known criminals. Systematic record-keeping turned policing into a science rather than just an art. By mid-century, law enforcement looked nothing like the night watchmen of 200 years earlier. Today's police and sheriff departments use computers, DNA analysis, body cameras, and instant communication networks that would seem like science fiction to earlier generations. Community policing, an idea that echoes Peel's principles from nearly 200 years ago, emphasizes building trust and preventing crime through relationships, rather than just enforcement. Departments face ongoing debates about accountability, use of force, training standards, and reform. But the core mission remains what it's been since the Medjay patrolled Egyptian markets: maintain order, protect people, and enforce laws. What started as informal community justice has become a complex, technology-driven institution that continues to evolve with society's changing needs and expectations. From desert scouts in ancient Egypt to algorithm-assisted investigations today, law enforcement has been shaped by thousands of years of social, political, and technological change. Understanding this history doesn't solve current challenges, but it gives us context. It shows us what worked, what failed, and why we organize public safety the way we do. The future of policing will be written by the choices we make now, informed, I hope, by the long path that brought us here.